Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Paulcast interview. I'm Paul. Over there is Danny After Dark. Like and subscribe. And we are so excited for our next guest. We've both read her book multiple times now. It's Freak Out, and we'll show you here. Freak Out, My Life with Frank Zappa, Laurel Canyon, 1968 to 71. And that's Miss Pauline Butcher. Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Yes, hi.
Thank you so much, Pauline, for being here with us.
Yes, hi.
Thank you for joining us. It's nice to meet you.
And very nice to meet you too.
Yes. So we actually stumbled upon your book. I was just going through. I wanted to listen to something, and I was looking into Frank Zappa a bit, and I ended up listening to your audiobook, and I was just captivated. I was like, this is so interesting, and not just because I'm a musician, and so it wasn't just on a musician level. It was, the book is good for anybody because it's such an outsider's look, but it's such a sober look at a time that was just over the top. And so I was so happy when you said that you would do an interview with us, because I was like, we have to talk to this. We have to talk to this woman. This is amazing.
Reads it very well. She gets Frank Zappa's voice for a woman really quite well, and Gail as well. Yeah. So I was pleased with that. Yes.
Right. I that was one thing I was going to mention too, is she did a fantastic job of Zappa. She got the nuance. I can't even do an impression of Zappa.
Yes, she really did. Good. She did. Yes, yes.
All right. So
the BBC did a radio adaptation of the book in 2014, and the guy who played Frank Zappa didn't get it as well as she did.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
yeah.
So
anybody who has Audible or any of the audiobook streamings, you need to listen to it. It's really, really good, really well performed. So we're talking about Frank Zappa. And why are we talking about Frank Zappa? Well, Pauline, you were Frank Zappa's personal assistant, among other things along the way. But can you tell us briefly how you met Zappa, became his assistant, and ended up living with him at the log cabin?
I met him in 1967 in London. He was over there to promote the first tour of the Mothers of Invention in Europe. So he came over with his manager because no one knew who he was or anything at all. And he did a set of outrageous interviews. He dressed up as a woman. He had his hair in pigtails. He got himself on the front of all the newspapers. I mean, this is what is interesting about Frank Zappa, is that he was very, very canny businessman. Right. And I don't think there are many rock stars who are trying to get on the thing realize or would even dream of doing such things to get themselves publicity. He didn't care. He dressed up in all these terrible outfits. He had boobs sticking out, and he had hairy legs showing on his stockings with, Lyle stock. I mean, it just was awful. And I showed them after I did some work with my colleagues at work, and they all said, "Oh, he's so ugly," So he was very clever. He wore a bowler hat, walking around London on his long hair, and he got lots and lots of publicity. And while he was there, he wanted the lyrics of Absolutely Free to be taken down, and I was employed to do that. And I couldn't understand a lot of them words because I was used to Love Me Do and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And so when I got Duke of Prunes and Call Any Vegetable, I didn't make sense. And so I made some of them up, and he laughed and laughed and said, "Oh, well, you should be making your own lyrics if you can write like this." And I said, "Well, if I did, I'd make them less rude." And he said, "Rude?" And I said, "Yes, Brown Shoes is an incredibly rude song. It's about a young 13-year-old girl who's making love to a middle-aged man on the White House lawn, and he says, cover her all over in chocolate syrup and strap her on again." Of course, it doesn't sound right in my accent, but anyway, even worse, I suppose, when it's proper accent. And I said, "That's so wrong, it's immoral." And we had a half an hour discussion on the morality of his lyrics and whether 13-year-olds should hear those songs, because he said his fans age from 13 to 50. And I said, well, he said our fans don't worry about what their parents think. So he was okay, Anyway, that's how we met, and I broke through on that basis. I broke through. We made a connection. So I can jump. I mean, there's a lot more to that. There's 5 chapters in my book. So I can jump forward to the log cabin if you like.
Before we do, I wanted to show everybody, because you were saying that the times were so different. And when you met Frank Zappa, you sent me this picture and you said, "This is who answered the door."
Yes.
And in that time, that would be something that would turn a lot of heads.
Absolutely.
And it is interesting.
When he opened the door, I was used to working for business people. I did work for celebrities as well. I'd worked for Gregory Peck and Terence Donovan and other Douglas Fairbanks Jr. So I'd worked for celebrities. So I wasn't fazed by celebrity, but I was fazed when Frank Zappa opened the door. And I said, "Oh my God, I'm sorry, I've come to the wrong room." And he said, "Pauline Butcher, come on in." And I went and I had to take down these lyrics. So, it was fortuitous for me that it turned out the way it did, because, as I say, it ended up with me after several more meetings going out to Hollywood.
Right. And it seemed like you just decided you were going to go with the flow of the current of everything. And it took you, like you say, there's a lot of things in between you meeting Frank Zappa and ending up in Hollywood. But it was like you basically said yes and just went along with it. And
well, I was employed actually to help him write a book. He'd been commissioned by Stein and Day, the publishers in New York, to write a book about politics of young people in America. And I was thrilled with this because I always wanted to be a writer. So I thought, wow, this is the way in. So I was thrilled. So I went willingly all the way over. Well, I had 3 sisters lived in Washington. So America was not a foreign place to me.
Right.
And so it wasn't far. And I was already in New York when he offered me the job. So it was just a flip over to California to go there. So it wasn't quite such an extraordinary thing for a young girl to end up over there. But I suppose it was for me, really, being as slim as I was.
Right. And there's just the stepping stones that you were able to do it. It was just like everything aligned up so that you could do that. Having the sisters in the States, to be that comfortable with going over there and having the job you did, ending up where you were. So because we are kind of jumping forward a little bit, we only have you for so long and we want to make sure that we get our questions in. What was the scene like at the log cabin, and how did you end up living there?
Right. Well, Frank invited me to go and live there and work with him at the log cabin. I had already found out that he was married and had a young child, because in London he hadn't told me that. So I went to New York to see him, thinking I was going to go and see this wonderful man I'd met, because I was knocked out by him. I have to tell you that the thing that knocked me out, apart from his gorgeous eyes, was the fact that he listened to me. I mean, during that discussion we had, he actually communicated with me, which in 1967, it's hard for anyone to know what it was like then. Men, or at least uneducated, university women, did not get listened to, especially not a secretary and someone, I worked for all these people. They just dictated their work, you took it down, you went out the door, nobody took any notice of you. So for him to actually to have a discussion with me and take notice of what I said, he didn't dismiss it. He actually took in, well, why was it immoral? It wasn't immoral. We had a proper discussion about it. And I was knocked out by that. The first time a man had shown any interest in me as a person, as a brain who had something to say.
Right.
So now, what was the question?
Sorry, it was kind of a two-parter. It was how you ended up living at the cabin.
Oh yes,
and what the scene was like
so
there.
When he invited me, he told me that it was a log cabin. It had 7 bedrooms and 7 bathrooms, and it had a pool. And I thought I was going to a real Hollywood home with white carpets and white sofas. And and when I got there the day before he arrived, I walked in, and in my room there were holes this big, and there were pipes showing through, and the door, the walls, white walls, painted walls, were filthy, and in the bathroom it was stained. The sink was stained. There was no hot water. It was terrible, and there was no light, and the mattress on the bed. I said, so Gail, his wife, but by this time I learned that she was, he was married. Right. And so she got me a different mattress, and there was no shade on the lamp, and it was terrible. So I got to bed that night, and when I woke up, I thought, well, Frank is going to arrive today, and he is going to say, oh, this is terrible, we'll move out, we'll get another proper Hollywood home. Frank arrived, it was totally not what I expected. He was thrilled because Log Cabin was the center of Laurel Canyon, and the other rock stars were all living in little houses in Laurel Canyon. And this was a massive place, massive. I mean, the living room was 60 foot long by 20 foot. And there were all these bedrooms, but they were all wrecked because the previous people living there were all the freaks, and they'd had a party of 600 people or something the week before. So it had been completely wrecked. So anyway, Frank was unfazed. I followed him around with my notebook and pad, taking what repairs would be made, all new fittings in the kitchen. My room would be done, and a recording studio built in the basement. And he was, we're knocked down these walls, we're knocked down. He was thrilled to bits with the whole thing of being like the king of Laurel Canyon, really. That's how it was.
That's interesting.
But the paradox was that he didn't like it once he got there. He didn't like it because everyone came in to see him and he wasn't interested. But I'll get to that later. Sure. So the house was not what I wanted, but I did eventually make my room. I painted it myself. I did the ceiling. I filled the holes. I put paper over it. I painted over it. I made it into the best room in the house, and Frank used it for all his meetings. So, yeah. So I wasn't only a secretary. I was
That's why it's because the nice room in the house. He's like, oh, well, I guess I'll just have my meeting in here.
Sorry, what?
Oh, because it was the nice room in the house, he just decided, well, I better have my meetings in here.
Yes, he did. Yes, they did. They all came in there. It was the best room in the house in the end. Yeah, it was.
Oh, that's funny. And you also had said that a lot of people had come through the log cabin, a lot of rock stars and stuff like that. Can you explain how that was and briefly how Frank took it with all the attention?
Well, the log cabin had lots of doors to the outside, and none of them had locks. None of them. So this was before the Manson Murders, when everything got changed. This was a free and easy, very happy, lovely area. Everyone was friendly, walked through each other's doors. That's how it was. So when he arrived on the Sunday, the first day, Joni Mitchell and David Crosby came to see him. And then there was a series of lots of different people came. I didn't know who they were because I didn't know anything about rock stars. And that's why Frank employed me, because I was not a groupie. So that was his appeal. He didn't want a groupie as a secretary who had all the rock stars, chase. So I didn't know. Anyway, Joni Mitchell came, but they told me the next day, but I really didn't know who she was. And then the other people came. Captain Beefheart came all the time, but he was a friend of Frank's, so he had more reason to be there. And he stayed overnight, 3 o'clock till 5 o'clock in the morning, talking about the blues. And I wish I'd realized, because Frank got me up one night to come and join them. And I was half asleep and I didn't take any notice, no interest at all, found it all thoroughly boring, and went back to bed. Had I realized I was going to write about it, I would, of course, written it more detailed, but I didn't. But yes, people came, and he was okay for the first 4 days. And by Thursday, the Mothers of Invention arrived and the equipment arrived. And once they arrived, he didn't really have any need for any more other rock stars to come to the house. And when they came, they got the message very quickly that Frank wasn't really into them. He wasn't, he did not socialize with other rock stars. He didn't. He wasn't interested. He was more interested in film people, the people he made films with. He did spend time with them. When the Pink Floyd came, Roger Waters and his colleague, he took them to the studio with him, but all he would do was play them his music. He wouldn't socialize.
Right. That was just single focus for him.
When I had my birthday party, we had to sit and listen to his music on my birthday party.
Right.
And he showed film of the Mothers of Invention he'd taken. And that's how my birthday party went. He was so focused on that all the time. Yeah.
Right.
But to finish off your question, by Thursday, he did not want any of them coming anymore. And when they arrived after that, he stayed at his desk. He didn't move to the sofa. He would stay at his desk, and they would wonder why they'd come, and they would go and come back again.
Right. And it wasn't a party house by any means.
No, and that's one of the things that makes me very cross, because there's lots of videos on YouTube about the log cabin and about Frank Zappa's time there. And there's 2 of them that talk about the mad parties that were at the log cabin when Frank Zappa was there. There was not one single party. It was like a monastery in there. Although there were 11 of us living there, we had to tiptoe around him. He was working all the time. We didn't dare make any noise. Moon, the little baby, was not allowed to go in the living room where he worked while he was working. It was a very austere environment, really. Although we had lots of fun, honestly, but that was when Frank wasn't there. Yeah, so he was working all the time. That's all he wanted, was to work.
Right.
And he rehearsed. He rehearsed with the Mothers every day.
Mhm.
Every day.
Right.
So when he rehearsed, writing, composing, rehearsed, writing, composing. That was his life. He ate at the piano. He did not eat with us. Never came in the kitchen to eat, except to come and find food in the fridge. And he would take out some what do you call those long American sausages, frankfurters.
Hot dogs.
And he would take them out and sniff them. How long have these been here, sort of thing, to see if it was okay to eat them. It was chaotic, really. Yeah,
Right.
except it wasn't, because it was very controlled as well.
Right. Well, you guys had a lot of your fun would be, like you said, when Frank wasn't there, or if you went out and did different things with different people, you got to meet lots of interesting people.
Well, I didn't go out. I couldn't get out. You couldn't get out. I
Oh,
couldn't get out of the log cabin because I didn't have a car. I couldn't get out. But we did hitchhike down Laurel Canyon. And in those days, it was perfectly okay to do so. In 1968, I am
right.
people did, with a conveyor belt of people, just cars would stop all the way down Laurel Canyon, and you could jump in anybody's car and get out the other end. It was normal.
Right.
So we did do that, but I only went down to I went down into Hollywood, yes, but I didn't at that stage socialize. I was far too separate, far too different. It took me 3 years to sort of become hippified. Yeah.
And I mean, we will be jumping around a little bit because we put different things together. So this is going to jump forward a bit. What made you leave the log cabin?
Who were the people at the log cabin?
No, what made you leave the log cabin after all was said and done?
Oh, right. Frank left after 5 months because, there were two things. One, Gail was very concerned about fire because it was completely wood, made completely of wood. It was a log cabin. And it did eventually burn down in a fire eventually.
Oh.
Yeah, it was destroyed in a fire, which is why it's so ridiculous when these videos on YouTube go around and say that's the log cabin. And it's the house next door because the log cabin burned down in 1983.
Oh, okay.
Well, thank you for setting the record straight.
Yeah.
It's really wrong on there. Yeah, they do. And I put my comments in, this is wrong, this is wrong.
Right.
Anyway.
Well, that's one of the things we like to do on here and some of the questions we have actually are pointed at things like that, like rumors that we actually get to talk to somebody like you who is there and see.
And I have a record of it in my diary and everything. And there were no parties, and the house next door is not the log cabin.
We got those two. Check them off the list.
Yeah. So he left because of the fire risk, and also because it was becoming dangerous, really. One afternoon, a man walked in. It was a very, very hot afternoon, and the front door was open. We were sitting, I was with the GTO'S, which I haven't come to yet, but I will in a minute. And this man arrived. It was a very hot day. It was 90 odd degrees. And Frank had opened the front door, and we were sitting on the sofa with a couple of the GTOs, and Wildman Fisher was there as well. He was another one of Frank's crazy clients, people he put on record. And this man came to the door, and he had a suit on and a shirt and tie and smarmed down hair, nothing like all the hippies, and parted on the side and smarmed down hair. And he came in and said, "Frank Zappa, I brought you a gift." And he handed Frank this, it was a bag, a see-through bag of red liquid, looked like blood. And Frank took it from him and turned round to the others as if to show it to them, as if to say, well, look at this, play to the stage sort of thing. And while he was doing that, this guy pulled out a gun and pointed it at Frank. And we all just sort of, lost our breath. And Frank turned around. This gun was pointing right at him, about 2 feet away, I would say, because he just handed him the stuff.
Right.
And Frank said, "Put the gun down." And the guy said, "I've just got it." And he said, "Well, if you don't put it down, the police will come and they'll find you and they'll put you in jail." And he said, "I can't go in jail. I can't go in jail again," or something like that. Somehow or another, Frank talked this bloke into the fact that he shouldn't have this gun. And he said to the guy, "I know where you can hide it, because if the cops come, they'll get you and they'll put you in jail." So he told the guy to follow him, go with him out into the front, through the front door. And he indicated to us, like idiots, to follow him. And so we went out and stood round the pond. There was this deep pond it was full of algae. It was not used. And we stood round it, and Frank picked up a stone and threw it in the pond. And he indicated to us to do the same. So it was indicating to him that he'd got to throw his gun in the pond. So Cinderella picked up, and she picked up something. I forget what she did. I've got it in the book. But anyway, and I picked up a twig, and that floated, so that was no good. And Wildman Fisher took off one of his holy shoes, because he only had whole shoes, and threw that in, and that floated as well. But it wasn't the idea. We're supposed to throw a stone in or something so it would sink. Anyway, then Frank told the guy to do it, and he did. He dropped the gun in the pond. I mean, it was really astonishing, really. It was.
That's amazing.
Then Frank gave him back the bag of blood and walked him down to the gate, which was always open, pushed him out the gate and closed it after him. And he came back, and we went in the house, and he closed the front door and went in the kitchen because we were all terrified. And I said to Frank, "Well, are you going to phone the police?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Why not?" And he said, "Because he doesn't deserve to go to jail." And I just thought he was either an idiot or else he was the bravest man I knew. I wasn't sure.
Right.
But, so there was this need to get out of the log cabin.
Right.
For those reasons. And it was being bombarded. We had no locks on the door. All they had to do was put locks on the door. I don't know why they never did that, but they never did. And they moved to a house in Woodrow Wilson Drive. They paid £73,000 for it. And it was recently sold after Gail died to Lady Gaga for $2.5 million or something. But she sold it again. I think she's selling it again. I think it's moved on to somebody else. I forget who else has bought it now. But
Oh, interesting.
Well, that's a good segue. One of the next questions we have was actually about Gail. In your book, you kind of describe, it looks like you guys had a bit of a tumultuous relationship with each other. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And what are your final thoughts on who Gail was as a person?
It's very confusing because she was, drop dead gorgeous looking. She was so pretty, just like Brigitte Bardot, really, I thought. I thought she had Brigitte Bardot's look. And she was difficult to get on with for me in the beginning because she interfered in my job. And she kept coming to my desk and saying, "Who are you writing to? Show it to me when you've done it, when you've typed it." and I'll take it to Frank and all this kind of thing. She got in between me and Frank. And if I ever tried to go and talk to him on his own, where he worked in the sitting room in the log cabin. It was a huge room. And he was in this corner with a grand piano, had a grand piano and a desk in this corner. And the other corner was all his cupboard full of hundreds and hundreds of LPs he had, and 45s and, the 78s, all those records he had. And in between that space was a square gap, I don't know what you call it, but anyway, that would lead through to the next room. And if I came into the living room where Frank was working at his desk or his piano, she would appear suddenly. She would be there right by it, she would suddenly be there. So I could never talk to him on my own. And I wanted to complain about it, but I couldn't. I couldn't complain because, it seemed like, well, how could I complain about his wife? How would you take someone complaining to you, Paul, about your wife? You wouldn't.
Right. No, of course not. It's an impossible situation to be put in.
Yeah, it was. So I bided my time, but later on I found out that when Frank decided he wasn't going to write the book that I'd gone there to write with him, he never wrote it.
Right.
He said, I have a fear that somebody at the publishers works for the FBI. And then, they've got hooks on me. And I thought he was ridiculous, that he would worry about something like that. Oh, no, that's not what I meant to say, actually. That's not what I meant to say. I meant to say that he asked me later on, and that's not what I meant to say. I meant to say that later on, when we moved to the office, Frank asked me to keep an eye on his manager, Herbie, and come back and report to him everything that he said and did. And I thought to myself, well, why do I need to keep an eye on Herbie when Herbie can tell him himself what he's doing and what he's not doing? And then it occurred to me, well, perhaps it was Frank all along that had asked Gail to keep an eye on me and to watch what I was doing and what I was doing and when I was doing it. And I thought he'd been the most liberal employer by leaving me alone to let me get on with my job. And so I wasn't sure. But anyway, as far as she was concerned, she was canny, very, very canny. She made friends with this one in the house. Then when that fell through, she made friends with this one. Then it was my turn, and she made friends with me. And I fell for it. She was very clever. I fell for it. I thought, oh, she likes me now. And I thought, we were the best of friends. And then she would be talking in the hidden bit of the house with Pamela Zerubica, we haven't talked about yet, Susie Cream Cheese. And Susie Cream Cheese hated her. I hated Gail because she'd got Frank instead of her. And so when I saw them talking together and whispering together, and then they would stop when I walked in, I used to think, well, is Gail really my friend? I didn't know. I never knew. Even later on, when I came back to England and she wrote me loving letters, how wonderful I was and so on. I can't say it was genuine because once Frank stopped coming to London, she stopped writing to me. And when I published my book, she was quite unpleasant about the book. She didn't like it. So I don't know. I thought we were very good friends. I was taking him. I really did like her. And actually, all through the period after Frank died, when all the fans were against her, I did defend her because I thought she was a wonderful mother. I thought she raised the children wonderfully. She was brilliant with the children. I thought so, anyway. And the way she tolerated Moon and let her boss her around, it was very charming, and she was charming. She could be charming, and so I'm left with a bit of a confusion because it does sound from the stories one hears that she did go a bit bananas at the end, towards the end of her life, and so I don't know. I have heard stories from close intimates of pretty unpleasant scenes at the house when Frank was dying and so on. So, it's a bit confusing. But I did talk about the log cabin, and when I worked for Frank, in the end, she was my friend and I liked her.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
How was before Frank passed away, what was your last conversation with him?
It was in 1988. I did an interview with him. It's on YouTube. I broke it down into 5 parts. And that's when I last saw him. I think I saw him after that. Oh, no, I saw him after that. No, that was the last time I saw him. In that visit. I mean, I saw him 2 or 3 times during that visit, but I did interviews with him. And then after that, Gail's letters stopped coming. And when Frank came to London, he was already a bit ill. And so I didn't have any contact with him.
Okay. Do you have any contact with any of the kids?
No, but Moon is supposedly writing her own memoir, which I'm really looking forward to, and I'm sure will be a bestseller because she's a very, very good writer. I love her book, America the Beautiful, and she is very honest, I think. She's a very honest writer, so I'm looking forward to that. Now, what was the question again? I've forgotten. But I keep in touch with her. Oh, well, yes. So what I was going to say was that she posted on Facebook about 3 years ago her bedside table, and on there was my book, my old original book. She was reading it, but she's never contacted me about it. So right. I don't know. No, I've not been in touch. I have a letter from her when she was a child. She wrote to me when she was a child, yeah.
Oh.
And she was 3 when I left.
Yeah.
That's it. This is kind of going off subject, but while you were talking about, or not off subject, but just off of our list here, when you were talking about how Gail was and how she was tough to read, and she kind of manipulated the situation. Do you think part of that was because Zappa, the way he was to her, like a woman in her situation?
Yes, I mean, when Mick Jagger came to the house, he and Marianne Faithfull sat in the kitchen, and Frank and Gail were on the other side of the big square table. And Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull, he spoke, she spoke, he spoke. It was like a double act, right? The other side of the table, Frank, droll, spoke, and Gail sat there mute. She never spoke when they socialized. When she was with him, she was always mute. And she told me that when I first met her in New York, and when Frank invited me to go and see him there, and I was shocked to find she was there. I didn't know he was married. She came out to get a taxi with me, and she told me that Frank was very jealous of her, and she was not allowed to look at another man. That she had once run across the road when they were in the street to talk to another guy that she knew. And when she came back, he was absolutely livid and said, "Don't ever do that again. Otherwise, or you're out," something like that. I mean, and so she never, when Mick Jagger came and, we went to the studio to hear Beggar's Opera being mixed, and we all went to the studio. They invited us there. Frank was annoyed because I went, because it was one of my few groupie days, because Mick Jagger was something as far as I was concerned.
Right.
And, yeah, so he was a bit annoyed with me. But anyway, so when they were there, Mick Jagger did flirt with her. He flirted with her, no, because he's a natural flirt. He's a very, very attractive man, actually. And you can see why he's got all these women running around after him. But so he tried to flirt with her, and she was very, very modest. She did not respond at all. She was sitting next to Frank. She wouldn't dare.
Right.
Wow.
So she wasn't afforded.
Obviously affected her. But I mean, if you want me to go into the other aspect of her life where she had to share all these women with him, that's another aspect of her that I think destroyed her, really,
Right.
probably destroyed her. She put up with it. She had this attitude, oh, well, if you're married to a rock star, you've got to put up with groupies. They're going to have groupies on the road. But Frank took it one step further, and he brought them back home with him. And that was a stomach-wrenching thing to do. I think that was, and I didn't judge him at the time. Well, it didn't happen when I was there. Only once Gail told me the first time that, do you want me to tell you this story?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
For sure.
Oh, okay. Well, when I was talking to Gail, she rang me up and said she was going to write a book about Frank's groupies. And and she said, I want you to help me, Pauline. So I said, oh, okay. So I was thrilled to bits. So another book I might write. And we were sitting having coffee, and she said, I'm going to start with you, Pauline. I said, I'm not Frank's groupies. And that's another story. But anyway, in the telling, she said that Frank had invited Francesca, a girl who was at the house quite often, to go down and sleep with him. And Gail had got all the bedding ready for them, and she'd got the duvet and the pillows and everything to take down, and she took them down for them.
Wow.
But Francesca came back up after a little while and said she couldn't do it because Gail, this is how she operated. She'd already made very close friends with Francesca. She'd got into Francesca's skin like she did with mine. And
right.
So Francesca couldn't do it. But there were others who'd already had on the road in Europe. He brought groupies back from Europe to stay at the house. He had another one, I forget her name, who wrote a book about him called, what was her book called? She died, unfortunately, but Always Frank or something like that. Being Frank is her book. Yeah, Being Frank. She stayed there as well. And Gail really was torn to bits, I think, when that was going on, because it wasn't just a groupie thing on the road. This was in her house, and she had to sleep upstairs on her own. Can you imagine what that did to her? So I think she deserves more sympathy than she gets. She gets a rotten thing. I know Moon's turned against her. She said horrible things about her in interviews. I don't know whether you've seen any of those.
I haven't. No.
You haven't?
No, not yet. No.
Well, if you watch any of her interviews, she not recently so much, but not long after her mother died, she was bitter about her, and told really bad stories about her. So I don't know how she's going. Maybe that's why her memoir is taking so long to come out, because she may be having second thoughts now about it.
Right. Or coming to terms as you get older with how
why
your parents were.
Her mother was so bad. So I mean, there's some Greek story, isn't there? Greek mythology about a woman scorned turns against her children after their father dies because of his infidelities, I think.
Right.
I should know the name of it. It's called a complex, something complex. Do you know what I mean?
I haven't read it, but it's interesting seeing, like, especially because her parents were so in the public eye and have books written about them and all that sort of stuff, how she comes to terms with that, how she comes to terms with how her parents were, because they weren't conventional by any means, and just her view of the whole thing, like where somebody else has hindsight like you about how Frank was with her and how that can damage a person, like if the person you love is doing stuff like that.
Yes.
So that's where it's tough for a kid to understand and be like, like, why didn't you leave?
The beautiful. It's a very disguised view of her parents. I mean, you can see Gail in it completely, and Frank as well, and Dweezil. And she is very sympathetic towards her father, and despairing, and has no with her mother. She's always exasperated with her mother. And she could be an exasperating person, I suppose, with the way she was.
Sure.
But it's possible that Moon is. I don't know. This is out of order, really, talking. But it's possible that she's reassessing her father a bit because of the way he treated her.
Right.
It wasn't really very good, was it? And
No.
but she had the choice, didn't she? She did have the choice. She could have
Right.
gone out, and she chose to stay. She chose to stay.
Right.
And each of these women in turn she made friends with. That's what she did. She did it that way. She made friends with each of the women.
Right. Man, it's so tough, like in a situation like that, being able to step out of it to know like how to get out of it, or if she just, that's all her identity was so sucked into that.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. But she had the chance to get out of it after Frank died, and then she came back. He told her to get out of the industry, out of the music business, but she came back because she obviously found, missed the limelight, I suppose. She came back and took the business over again. So
yeah.
Right. Danielle, do you have another question ready to go, or is it? Oh, okay, here we go. Well, we're kind of moving along a little bit. You ended up being the manager of the GTOs.
Oh, yes.
So could you
have you got a picture of them to show? Because you can't.
I do, yeah.
Yes, he does.
So
so tell us a bit about that. How that came to be.
There you are.
That's me with them, yes. And there's more pictures. But yes, well, Frank, these girls were freaks. They weren't really freaks, but they those two at the front, they were normal girls who just dressed up. These two at the beginning.
Okay.
At the front, that was Sparky and Pamela. But the others, these wow, they were really freaks, and they did live off the street, and they did live the hard life, I think. And Frank brought them in and turned them into a group called the GTO'S, where they couldn't sing. And it was my job to make them rehearse. They had to write their own songs, and they wrote 10 songs, I think. And then we had to get musicians in to help them. Lowell George came in, Rod Stewart came in and sang on one of them. They got help with this album, and it was my job to get them to the rehearsals and to they drove me ragged, really, because I had no idea what I was handling, did I? I mean, for example, in the car going to the TV studio. They got an audition for one of the top TV shows. And in the car, she was sniffing like this in the back of the back seat. And I said, "Oh, what are you doing, Cinderella?" She said, "Oh, it's my smelling salts, Pauline." So I said, "Smelling salts? I thought they went out with my grandmother." So when we got to the studio, I said to her, "Cinderella, why don't you take your smelling salts before you go on?" Because you don't want to be sniffing when you're being interviewed. Oh, so anyway, we got home and I got a phone call from Gail, because at that time I was living up the street. And she said, "Frank wants to see you, get in here." And he was the only time he ever lost his temper with me. He was so mad. He said, "What do you mean telling people to take cocaine in the studio, Cinderella?" And I said, "Oh, cocaine, I didn't realize." Oh, she said it was smelling salts. I believed her. So anyway, he was livid with me. And that's how absurd it was for me to be looking after these guys. I didn't know anything. I was a cog in totally out of place in the place, which in a way helped me to write the book, because I was out of place, and so I could see it differently. Right. Okay.
Absolutely. And it was interesting that Frank kept finding things for you to do. He really liked having you around. He would be like, "You're going to write this book. You'll do this. Pauline will do this." And he initially got you in there by saying that you wrote a song for him, right?
Oh, yes, that's right. Yes. Well, no, I mean, you mean how I got to be employed, you mean?
Yeah. How he first got you on the books.
Because I couldn't be employed because I didn't have a card. I didn't have a green card to allow me to be employed. So he employed me as a songwriter. And then he was going to write this book, which was due at the end of the year. So at the end of the year, they would write the song off as a dead loss. So all the money they'd given me would be written off as a loss. So it was very clever.
Yeah. Right, savvy businessman again.
Yeah, but the end of the year came and I was still there. So I applied for a green card. So it was a bit dodgy for about a while. But I told them all, which was quite true, that I'd sold my car in England to my sister and I was living off the money from my Mini, which I had in England. I'd bought brand new.
Right.
Nice. Just to wrap up the GTOs, are you still in contact with any of them today?
Sorry, what did you just?
Just to wrap up the GTOs, do you still talk to any of them today?
Oh, right. Well, there's only, most of them have died. Marcy died a couple of years ago. She just finished her memoir. Pamela is still alive, and so is Sparky. And I think they're the only two out of the 7. Pamela, she cut me off once I wrote my book. I don't know why, but I always praised her own books, because her book, I'm With the Band, has been a bestseller for years. And she's always on all the programs and everything. And so I've always praised her and her books, but for some reason she did not like it, and she hasn't said anything about my book anywhere ever. And when I wrote my play, I wrote a play about Frank and Gail in London in 1975, when he was there for a court case, and she was absolutely antagonistic about that and said I had no right to do it. So it's very odd. I don't understand it, but there you are. She's writing about all these rock stars and their private parts, and I'm writing a very innocent play about Frank Zappa. Oh dear. So I don't know. I don't quite understand it. Never mind. It's not worth worrying about, really.
Right.
I do keep in touch. No, Sparky is living a very straight life in the valley and wants nothing to do with any of it. So
right. Oh, it's interesting. Okay. It's interesting how the after that amount of time, how things end up going.
Yes. Well, he thought they were all going to marry, he thought they were all going to marry electricians and plumbers and things, and they all ended up marrying rock stars. So he was totally wrong about that.
Hey, missed the mark on that one by a tax bracket. Oh, that's funny. Okay, so I'm jumping back a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about the Mothers of Invention and how your relationship with them, and they actually practiced right under your bedroom, right?
Yes.
That's amazing.
Oh my goodness, yes. So every night, but of course the first night they got there on the Thursday. I got there Sunday. Frank arrived Saturday. Frank arrived Sunday. They arrived Thursday, and they set up and they rehearsed on Thursday night. So it was a real shock underneath my room. But the interesting thing is they were still playing at 11 o'clock at night, and 2 policemen came in. Oh, terrified me because all these guns and everything. And Gail rushed down and got Frank, and he came up looking pale because he obviously thought they'd found drugs. And
Right.
He was terrified. I mean, we haven't mentioned that, have we? That
No.
Frank did not take drugs. I mean, he looked like a drug addict, but he didn't, he didn't take drugs. And he was against anyone who took drugs, and we weren't allowed to have them. Of course, I wouldn't want one in anything near me. But so he was frightened. He was afraid when he came up the stairs that they'd found drugs. That's why they were there. But instead, they said, "Well, we've had a few complaints about the noise of the music. It's 11 o'clock, and so could you, either soundproof the house or stop at 10 o'clock." So from there on, they started at 6 every night, and they rehearsed till 10, 4 hours every night. Well, not Sunday, Saturday and Sunday, I don't think. It was just 5 days. Although Frank would have done it the weekend, but I think the guys wanted, time with their family.
Right.
Yeah, and go on. Yeah.
No, keep going.
The thing about the Mothers of Invention is that Frank, the first night he got there, which is in May 1968, we were sorting out his records to put them in these big cupboards, hundreds and hundreds of them. And he stopped to say, because the other thing about Frank is that he could not do 2 things at once. So he couldn't put the records in the thing and talk. He had to stop and talk. On stage, he would sing or play the guitar. He did not ever play the 2 together. You watch all the videos, you will see he never played and sang. He could only sing or talk, and then he would play the guitar. Okay, so we were putting these records away, and then in silence, total silence. And then he would stop, and then he said, "I want to break up the Mothers of Invention." This was my, the first night there. I couldn't believe it because I had seen them at the Albert Hall in London. And I thought they were brilliant. I absolutely loved it. And he said, "Well, they can't play the difficult music I'm writing now. I'm writing such difficult stuff." So he said, "I want to cancel." Anyway, he didn't have the courage at the beginning to tell them because he said, "They're my friends and I don't want to hurt them." But by the time June or July came, he was so fed up, he told them he was going to break it up. And they were furious. And Ian stepped in and said, "Well, look, if it's the problem of rehearsal, that you haven't got time to rehearse and write your music, then I'll rehearse them and then you come and join when they know the numbers." Because he was teaching them 10 bars. They would learn to play that. Then the next 10 bars, funny arrangement, I thought, and they learned it like that, 10 bars at a time.
That's interesting.
So Ian said he would do it. And so Frank was happy with that. And they kept that going for another year till August 1969, when he finally had enough and he broke up the Mothers finally. And he did it by phoning up Jimmy Carr Black and telling him to phone all the others and tell them. And they had no money given to them after that. And they had no week, they had no notice given. It was just, we'd come back from tour of Canada. They were in Ottawa. They came back. When he got home, he phoned up Jimmy Carr Black and said, we're breaking up the group. And they had a meeting about 3 weeks later. And in the meeting, Frank told them, or at least Herbie told them, that they owed Frank $10,000 and that they would have to pay it back. And
that's insane.
They were, they were shattered. I mean, I have to tell you, I want to, this interview, unfortunately, somehow has ended up slaughtering Frank Zappa. I hope after we've done this question, we can talk about the wonderful bits of him, because it does seem
it's not come across like that. It's for sure and I think it kind of goes without saying. There's a lot of info out there about what an amazing musician, and you've also said how he could really focus in on a person and make them feel like they were the only person in the room.
Yes, I will come to that. Yes, I will come. So I've finished off this story. So they were so furious. You could see their anger in their faces. He relented and said, well, let's forget the 10 grand and call it.
Right.
Quit. He dropped it. Yeah.
I can't even imagine having been in bands myself, being in a band for that long, and then being like, the band's over, plus you owe me 10 grand.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, it was quite true. He was paying for it out of his own money when they were in, they didn't pay. The concerts didn't pay. He had to draw it from his own money and stuff. So it wasn't paying for him to do it. So, and he wanted to write different stuff and so on. He suggested that they could meet up again later after he'd had a break, which is what he wanted. But they weren't interested in that. And they went off and got other jobs. So that's how it was. But they were a great bunch. They had a lot of, good, I liked their music. So it was good, yeah. But I would like to talk about the good sides of Frank Zappa as well. I mean, why I was so enamored with him. I mean, I was. There's no question about it. I was totally enamored with him because he was so kind as well. He was so kind, and he was the only man who had any belief in me that I could be a writer. And he told me while I was at the Laurel Canyon that I should write about it. I should write about the experience. And I did try, but I couldn't do it. I was too into it, and I felt too embarrassed writing about all these people I was with. I couldn't do it.
Right when you're in it.
Took the break, to be able to do it. So, but he did have that belief in me, and as you were saying, in everybody else. I mean, everybody who came in contact with Frank thought that they were the most important person in his life. He focused in on you. And, he was not the sort of person that when he was looking at you, he would look over there or look over there. He was focused in on you totally. And you felt prized, you felt important. And he did that with his musicians, I think, and made them excel in whatever instrument they were playing.
Right.
He gave me the belief that I could write. And I told him I wanted to go to the UCLA to be a journalist. And he said, don't do that, because they'll turn you out like every other journalist. So do your own thing. And I said, well, I can't, he said, just send them off, keep doing it. And eventually you'll break through. And of course, his great thing I've got on my wall in my study here is to fail is the norm, to succeed is rare. That's what he told me.
Nice.
Wow. That's a brilliant quote. That's so true.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, the dichotomy of people. We have to look at that a lot, considering all the different subjects we look at, and being that everybody has two sides, and everybody can be, as as much of a jerk as they can be an amazing person at times. So it's also really interesting looking at the way Frank Zappa was brought up, like his father, how, like, a military guy, and he comes from a military background, and he kind of seemed to run his life like an offset version of that. Like, as much as you try not to be your parents, you end up sort of turning into them in a way. And it seemed to me that he ran his band very military fashion. His life,
yes, he did. I never thought of that connection, I must say. I hadn't ever thought of that. Yes, he did. And it is a paradox, isn't it? Because he believed in, total freedom, be the person you are and everything. And yet with his band, he was like a military person. Yes, he was. That's quite right. Yes.
He was very rigid, but in the way of a sort of new age person. Like, kind of, it was a really interesting dichotomy. I think that's why people are so fascinated with him. I even got it out of you talking about how he wrote his scores. Everything was so perfect, and everything was very, like,
yes.
And I had my this is off sort of, but my stepdad was an old English guy, and he was in the military, and I remember everything he did was sort of had that sort of thing to it. So when I read in your book about how Zappa was, that's how it kind of put together that he was very military. He's like, nope, no drugs. It'll mess you up. Your brain will be like, you can't be all that you are if you're blazoed on whatever. And that's
absolutely,
just that.
Yes. I mean, he was full of contradictions, but I guess we all are, really.
Yeah.
We all are, in a way. But I was just looking down my list to see. I was going to say about his songs. We haven't discussed his music at all, and they are very contentious, a lot of his songs. I mean, he's got some beautiful music. When he was composing in the log cabin on the grand piano, my room was off the living room, so I had 2 steps down to come into the living room from my room. So sometimes I would sit on those 2 steps, and it was a big room, as I say, 60 foot. So he was about 40 foot away from me, and I could sit and watch him play at the piano. And he couldn't play with 2 hands properly. So when he composed, he had long sticky fingers, like long sticks, and he would pick out the tune with this hand and then the tune with this hand. And he might play a few chords and stuff. But when he'd written it all down, then he would get Ian Underwood to come and play the piece for him, because he couldn't play it himself. He could not play his own music.
That's so interesting. That's really interesting too, because now with computers, a lot of people write music, they just piece it together because they can just throw it all up. You don't have to be able to play the stuff that you're writing. You could put it together and learn it after. And so I found that very interesting as well, that's the way that he wrote. And it's amazing that he could kind of hear that. But he couldn't get it out of his head at the same time.
Yes. So I was just looking to see what about the contentious songs I wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
And what is odd, the other disparity between him is that he looked very contentious, didn't he? He looked, his image was sort of a bit battling sometimes with that long hair, and sometimes he looked quite like a drug addict, I suppose. But in real life, he couldn't have been more different. He was quiet, he was gentle, he was not at all contentious in his behavior. He was just quiet. He never raised his voice. The only time, as I said, he got cross with me was when I made that mistake about the smelling salts. But yeah, so he was that's actually how he was so commanding, I think, because he was so quiet. He was so quiet, and then he would focus on you, and whatever you said, he would give it full respect. He never responded. I suppose toward the end, some of the interviews, he did show a little bit of sarcasm, but I don't know that he did in his interviews. He always answered questions with full respect, I think.
Right. Yeah. One of those people that's actually like fully in the moment with you and listening to what you're saying and thinking about what they're going to say back, not just waiting to say something.
Yes, yes.
All right. So moving along, Danielle, do you want to ask the next question?
So there was a quote that Gail Zappa had said to Mike Walker. It was...
Sorry to interrupt for a sec. This kind of piggybacks off of you had said that about the guy who had come into the house with the bag of blood and the gun. But you had also said in your book that the Manson murders had been what made like the doors start to get closed, right?
Yes,
that had happened.
Yes.
That had happened before, right? The thing with the guy pulling the gun on you.
No.
Oh, okay.
The man with the gun came in May 1968. The Manson murders were a year and a half later.
Right.
In 1969. So that's why I don't think we were quite as frightened as we would have been, or Frank took it so lightly, was because the whole atmosphere in Laurel Canyon was of a friendly thing. Had that happened after the Manson murders, that would have been a totally different thing.
Right,
that would have been totally different.
Sort of more what
I think he thought he could deal with this guy.
Right. More what I was getting at was the like you guys started getting a little more scared after that incident, right? Or did you still have the fully open door policy until?
No, I think we were all frightened, and we moved. That I'm not sure in what date that gun was. It was probably about the end of July, beginning of August, and we moved out at the beginning of September.
Right.
But no, we had a guy live in the house who was our protector.
Right.
We had a guy
after that.
Well, no, we had one before, but he mainly looked after Gail and took her shopping and carried all her stuff for her and was her servant in a way. And then when he promoted to the road manager of the Mothers of Invention and went on tour, we got a new guy come in from London called Kansas, and he was our minder. He came immediately after the guy with the gun episode, and because they were leaving to go on tour. So Kansas arrived, and he was a reassurance for us while they were looking. Gail went out straight away, started looking for a house.
Sure. Okay. So so what I was more thinking was that there was dangerous stuff happening in that time. What we get a lot of as we look more into it, that the flower power movement, there were a lot of people who did believe in that, but there was also a lot of like drugs and stuff like that happening. People just out of their minds from whatever, and people living on the street.
I think you're talking about Gail's interview when she said that she saw the Manson gang hanging around outside the log cabin. I do think that's a little bit, I don't think that actually was the case. In 1968, it was not heavy drugs going on. It was going on, but they weren't out of their minds with it. It was another year later before it started to get really heavy and problematic. But in 68, we left in September. Maybe, I know the GTOs were into not cocaine.
Heroin.
They were into heroin, you had said.
Yes, heroin, yes. But they had heroin, that's right. But so there were drugs around, but we were not troubled at the log cabin by that.
Okay, so it wasn't something that was, with Frank.
She made a comment in the interview that they were wandering around the back of the log cabin. Well, she wouldn't have known who the hell they were. I mean, there were people wandering around all the time, and they were just hippies as far as we were concerned,
Right. We have actually a quote. It's not that one, but we have another quote from her. Danielle was just going to read before I interrupted.
Okay.
Yeah, so Gail had said to Mike Walker, quote, if you were surprised by the Manson murders, you were not connected to what was going on in the canyon. If you took drugs and dampened your perception, then that's why you didn't notice. But for those of us who were drug-free, we noticed, end quote.
Right. So she noticed what? She noted what?
Why she wasn't surprised that the murders had happened in Hollywood.
My God. Oh, wow. Well, oh dear, that's a bit of a jump, isn't it? Don't you think?
That's the best reaction.
I mean, God, the lawyers and accountants in the offices were all taking cocaine, and they're not running around murdering people. The guy was a lunatic, wasn't he? I mean, it was nothing. I think that's well, I would object to that description of what was happening.
Well, you were sober and you were there too, right? That's
yes,
one of
but I by that time we had moved into Woodrow Wilson Drive, and that was totally different from Laurel Canyon. That was, it was the sort of middle class, all behind sort of locked doors already and stuff. It wasn't this free and easy thing that was in Laurel Canyon down there. So I don't know how it changed everything, is what I want to say about the Manson murders. But it was a shock. I mean, the way Gail is saying it there is like they were expecting it. It was not expected. God, it was totally out of the blue, and everybody was terrified. It was shocking, and it was terrible. And Frank immediately fortified his house, put a camera down there at the gate. And where I lived, where I was just up the road with Matt Cohen, Frank's lawyer, we had 4 dogs, 4 cats, ducks, goats, rabbits. We had all these animals. And he said they would protect us, and which, in fact, the ducks were the best, because if anyone came near, the ducks went mad. So, and then these 4 fierce dogs, they were big, 2 Alsatians, I forget what they were, but they were pretty fierce dogs. And so we didn't do anything up our end, but it was frightening.
Sure.
And it changed everything. And no longer did you get hitchhiking down Laurel Canyon. That stopped overnight. And because you didn't know who the murderers were for ages. You didn't know who they were and who might be coming through the door again.
Right.
So that was very frightening. And then they found him, and that made it even worse because he had long hair and a beard. And so everybody from there on started cutting their beards off.
Right. Yeah.
Because the image was so. And I came back from my holiday afterwards, and I was surprised that Calvin Schenkel, who's the artist, still had his hair hanging down, because a lot of people started tying them back. They tied their hair back. Yes.
Interesting. We have a couple of more questions about this, just because it's good to have you, who was actually immersed in it, to ask about.
Yeah.
You had said in the book you were close to Linda Ronstadt for a time. Yeah. She actually lived next to Gary Hinman, who was one of the first victims of the Manson clan. And she had spoken about it publicly in a couple of interviews, about how she remembers them hitchhiking up and down, and remembers like leaving her house after that happened. But did she ever talk to you about it? Did she ever say, I knew these people?
No, because I only knew Linda Ronstadt when I lived at, sorry, I'll start again. No, I didn't see her around that period. I saw her earlier in the year when she would come to the house, but by later in the year, she stopped coming to our house. So I think she stopped, Herb Cohen must have stopped being her manager by then. And maybe Matt Cohen stopped being her lawyer, because she stopped coming by then. So I never had those conversations with her.
You weren't in contact with her after
the
murders had happened?
I wasn't a friend of hers. I mean, she came to the house when she crashed on the sofa in Matt Cohen's house, and we used to have coffee together. And I couldn't get over how she would talk to me about her unhappiness with boyfriends who dumped her or something. And I couldn't get over it, because she was so beautiful and so, so pretty, and she was so sweet as well. And I thought, well, if she can't get on with blokes, what chance have I got? I was really, it just, she was having a tough time with boyfriends, and I didn't have any boyfriends, but so I just thought, well, I don't have any chance then if she doesn't.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. One of the other people that are affiliated with the Manson, the whole Manson clan, was Bobby Beausoleil. And, he was an actor and musician with bands. And he supposedly sang backup for Frank Zappa. Did you ever see Bobby Beausoleil when he was supposedly doing this?
No.
This is what he looked at like at the time.
Who is that?
That's Bobby Beausoleil. That's the guy who actually murdered Gary Hinman, the guy next door to Linda Ronstadt. And it said that in Manson, in his own words, that he when he had met Bobby Beausoleil, he had sang some backup vocals for Frank Zappa. And so
right. Well, yes. Well, I would not be in the studio. You see, I don't know. I very rarely went to the studio, so I wouldn't have known him. I didn't know the music side of it very much.
And nobody ever had. Well, I mean, I guess obviously nobody had ever mentioned after that came out. It's like that guy sang on such and such a song.
No.
Right.
No. I don't think I didn't hear anything about that at all. Or if I did, I've forgotten it. And I didn't write it down, because if it wasn't written down, I haven't got it, because it was 40 years ago when I wrote this book.
Right.
So unless it was written down, I remembered things once I read them, but if it wasn't written down, I probably wouldn't remember it.
Well, right. I mean, like you said, the log cabin, what was it? You said you were there 5 months? And think of 5 months in an entire lifetime. And everyone's like, remember this one moment of that 5-month period of your whole life? So it's good that you actually had written it all down. That's amazing. I guess that's the reason that we have this book now.
Okay, Paula, do you want to ask the next question?
Well, we already had that one. pretty much. Has anybody else, other than the people that we spoke about before, has anyone reached out to you since you published the book that was in the book and said either positive or negative?
No, I think people who were negative just never got in touch.
Right.
They won't say anything negative. Ian Underwood, I sent him the book. He didn't respond. He obviously didn't like it.
Right.
So that's how people respond. If they like it, of course. Art Trip wrote a really nice review. He liked it, and I can't think, of other people.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, if people are in the book, they don't seem to like what I've written, and I haven't written anything bad about them, actually.
No, that's what I was going to say. It's really interesting that anybody would have a problem with what you wrote, because nobody comes out looking bad in your book.
No.
Well, I'm not over pleased with what I wrote about Ruth Underwood, actually. I think I would modify that a bit. But
okay.
Yeah.
How
well,
so?
I guess I have done in this. I've modified it a little bit.
Okay.
In this version, yes, I have. Yeah.
How so, if you don't mind me asking? How so did you want to modify it? Like what made?
How would you modify it?
How would you modify it?
How did I modify it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, in this version, you mean, compared with the first version? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yes. I made it more streamlined toward Frank and myself and Gail. I made that more of a focus, a line through, whereas the other one is more about Pamela Zarubica, a lot more about the GTO'S. It flounders around a lot of other people more. And this time I don't know whether you got that, but it seemed like it was a story about the three of us, really.
Yeah.
Relationship with them. So that's how I focused it this time. And it really was that story.
Right. Yeah. And it did come across that way too. Yes. As well as, and Danielle will talk to you more about it or ask you more about it, but you kind of came into your own through all those experiences. So Danielle, do you want to ask the question we got for that?
Well, I was going to say, when I read the book, the book, like you'd asked, the book is really great because even if you're not a Frank Zappa fan, it's a really great book because, coming from a psychology background, as I mentioned to you earlier, I really took the book as somebody coming into their own and having these wonderful experiences, moving somewhere new and having a real once in a lifetime opportunity, and everything that came from that, then moving back to your home and now having to start anew in life without using the Frank Zappa name that you could have used in the United States. So it was fascinating that way. It's really like a coming to yourself.
Yes, well, that reminds me of what I would like to add, which we haven't discussed, is that women's liberation came on the headlines in 1969, and that changed everything for me. I mean, it was astonishing. On the front pages, they were pictures of them with no bras on, charging up the street with banners, love me less, respect me more. And I thought, wow, that's great, And I read Kate Millett's book, Sexual Politics, and I thought it was brilliant. I raced up to see Frank. I thought he would be, he was always for the underdog, wasn't he? So I thought, well, the women are underdogs, so he's bound to be in favor. And he wasn't. He wasn't. Oh, my goodness. He was, why do you want to be a man? Why do you want to put on trousers? I think, women don't have any power in oh my goodness, it was just astonishing. And he just called them all dykes. He said they're all dykes. Oh, I shouldn't say this really, because here I am criticizing him again.
No, that's okay. It's like we say, it's the three-dimensional person.
Yeah, we're looking at it from that was back then, so we're trying to look at it through that set of eyes, not so much now.
Right.
Well, what was paradoxical about that was for me, he was the only person that encouraged me to be a writer, and there he was condemning these women for wanting to be, more than just housewives. So it was a paradox, really. But I think later on, I don't know. I didn't discuss that with him when I met him in 1988, and I met him before. I didn't ever raise that issue about women with him. But I think he must have changed his view a bit towards the end. And I suspect he would have taken on the Me Too movement, probably argued against it a bit. But even so, I think he must have changed his attitude. At that time, he really didn't have any time for it at all. But for me, that was the opening. That was the opening. I thought, well, I can do more. I can do more than be a secretary. I can go to university. And then I told him I'm going to apply to UCLA. And then he told me not to bother. So there we were. I just found women's liberation a wonderful boost. And it must have been to hundreds of women. And then the feminist movement took on from there. And it's been a bit of a muddled journey, hasn't it? But anyway, it has helped no end of women. So I'm glad.
Yeah, it's
can't imagine what it was like in 1968. There were 2 women in American politics in the House. I don't know whether they were in the Senate or in the House. There were only 2 women there.
Right.
At that time.
It's amazing the changes and everything, like you say about it's all muddled up and everything. Any type of learning or changing of society takes forever, and the growing pains are ridiculous sometimes. It's like it's like a pendulum. It starts swinging the right way. You're like, oh, this is great, and then it goes way too far, and then you're like, we got to go back, and then it goes way too far the other way. But so.
Are you always so accommodating?
Sorry?
Are you always so accommodating? Are you always so charming?
No, I assure you he is not. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, no, I was raised by a single mother, and it was very like look at people. She's very empathetic, and she taught me to be very empathetic, and so I try and always I'm enjoying learning all this stuff. I'm enjoying talking to people like yourself and everything. So I guess, and I'm terrible at taking compliments too, so that's why I'm rambling. But thank you very much. I try and make it fun because you've taken time.
Well, Frank Zappa had that type of thing too. He was very, very, he was something else, really. He was a special person, and I don't think I've conveyed it very well here, but
I think
no, you did.
You did, and I think it's important that people see both sides. I think there's people who will put somebody on a pedestal to the point of ignoring like glaring character flaws if they're going to get into that much. But then you can't go the other way either too much because
he was very new to his stardom at that point when I met him, and I think it was all he was finding his feet. He was finding his own feet and what he wanted and how he was and stuff. So he was treading carefully. But even then, he gave an interview to the music paper in London in 1968, and he scorned Paul McCartney because he'd phoned up Paul McCartney to ask him if it was okay to do that album cover of We're Only in It for the Money.
Right.
And Paul McCartney had said, well, I'll have to ask my manager and see what he says. And Frank said, I tell my manager. I don't ask my manager. My manager does what I tell him.
Right. Yeah, very, very, like you say in the book, incredibly confident, just like
Yes,
otherworldly confidence
it
in
was.
anything
Yes,
he was going to do.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
And you
GTO
need
is
that
so
to get,
multi-dimensional and complex, and your book does a really great job of showing all sides of Frank.
It does. Oh, good.
absolutely.
Thank you. That's very good. Okay. And do you want to have you got any more questions or
We
is
were
that
just
it?
going to ask, so do you have any upcoming projects that you have in the works? And when will the new edition of your book be available in Canada, in the United States?
Well, that's a problem, isn't it? I have got copies I can send to Canada if people would like to message me, or they can write to me at my email address. Which do you think is better? They message me on Facebook,
Right.
and I can send them signed copies. But the copies available in the shop and on Amazon and various book depository and all of that, they will be available in the next couple of weeks.
Okay.
But
Right.
they're not at the moment, but I think you can pre-order.
Right.
Nice.
So there's ways to get it right now. There's also Audible. If people have Audible, you can listen to
Yes,
it. And we talked
that's
about how wonderful that
yes.
was.
But I must warn people: the other Kindle version is
Yeah.
not this version. It's the old one. It's the
Okay.
old. It's not the new version. Is not on Kindle, so you can't get it there.
Okay.
No,
Well, we will
I
also, sorry, we'll also keep people posted now that we've done this interview, and we'll let people know when it's available, because it's my top 3 this year for sure. It's a
oh,
wonderful
very
book.
good.
And
And so your next one will be Moon
yeah.
Zappa.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
excited for
The
that.
Flowers.
I
Yes.
would love it. I would
Don't
love to talk to
mention my name
Dweezil.
to either of them.
Don't yeah. Yeah, no, I'd love to talk to Dweezil Zappa, being the
I'm
guitar
sure you
nerd that I
will.
am.
I'm sure you will sooner or later.
He's very cute. I would love to talk to him too.
Oh, that's awesome. All right, so before we go, we will say, like
I can't
Pauline just
believe
said,
it's yes.
yeah, you had said you can get a hold of her on Facebook under Pauline, or it's under the Freak Out, My Life with Frank Zappa, Laurel, and that is Pauline Butcher. That's on Facebook. You can also go to her website, which is paulinebutcher.com, and we will let you know as soon as we know when you can get the book around
yes,
here.
yes. That's it. Very good.
Yeah. So, is there anything else you wanted to say before we take
No, I
off?
was just checking about Frank. No, I think I've mentioned all the things. We did it in a sort of mishmash, funny way, didn't we? But I think that's better. Yeah. So yes, I think I would like to mention the fact that Frank was an excellent businessman. I think that's the thing that people probably don't underestimate about him, and that his success was achieved with no help from radio, and that was the only outlet at that time. There was no other way of getting your music heard other than in concerts or on the radio, and no one played his music on the radio. So he succeeded even under that, and he did it because he was a very canny businessman. He advertised in comics, and he did things differently from other people. He could think out the box, and he was very, very good. And so that's the side I would encourage any new musicians trying to make it in the world of music to consider, to brush up on their business skills as well.
Absolutely. And it's really his, and I don't even know, I guess it must have just been natural. His self-promotion was incredible. And
yes.
and all that sort of stuff, like you say, just the the businessmanship of what he was doing. And that was before, like, there's bands that have come along now that have been able to get their music out there because there's different ways of doing it. But he really was a pioneer of self-promotion and being like as much business as music, instead of just like going off into the stars and letting somebody else handle it.
I suppose one last thing I ought to say is that something about the music. I mean, I thought something about the music. He was astonishing, and lots of people don't like his music. Let's face it; it's not mainstream, is it? But
Sure,
he was so incredible that he could cover classical music, jazz, doo-wop, blues, rock and roll, and satire, and he could do all of that. And it was so incredible that he could. He was also a great artist as well. He did great artwork, and so the man was multi-talented. And I think I wanted to impress people on trying to give his music a listen. And what record are you going to play? A piece of music, or?
We don't have the rights to, but we've been playing, like,
YouTube frowns upon that.
Yeah, we do shows where we can play some of his music and then just erase the show after. But the way I've been going through it, it's interesting because with Frank's music, there's a different, like, it's like a different song can grab anybody, and then that's what starts to suck you in.
Yes,
like
yes.
The band T-shirt I'm wearing right now, Moontooth, they covered Magic Fingers.
Oh yeah.
And that was one of the first. I was like, wow, that's a really cool guitar riff, because I'm obsessed with the guitar. And but then there's people who are like you say, there's a lot of classical musical influence in there, and arrangement, and just something for everybody. And incredible that he had I think it's like this next level focus that makes it you able to even be able to do business and music at that level, be able to shut out all the noise and just single-minded, this is what I'm doing, and it doesn't matter how I get there, I'm going to get there. That's what sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think so. I keep planning to make my own album out of all the tracks I like, because each of the albums has 2 or 3 tracks I don't like, and I always keep saying I'm going to make my own album. I haven't done it yet, but I ought to do it before I die.
The Zappa mixtape that you can have in your car ready to go.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll finish up by again saying thank you so much.
Thank you.
Everybody make sure that you check out Pauline's book, Freak Out, My Life with Frank Zappa, Laurel Canyon, 1968 to 1971. Danielle's got it already. I'm getting mine in the mail. Thank you so much, Pauline. And we will keep everybody abreast of the news of when we can get the book.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, well, I thank you very much. You make such a charming couple.
Oh, thank you very much.
I'm the better half of this duo.
I'll argue after the show.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Good night.
All right.